So now their decks are ready to be shared, but the question is, how do we share them?
That's a good question.
So the question is, how do you get the slides to actually present?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'd used the manage slide thing and uploaded them manually because it didn't seem to be doing it straight from the data tracker. So when I look at manage slides, I see 3 decks ready to be shared, but I don't see any way to actually get them to show up. Like, shouldn't I be able to click the little meeting material thing and have them show up?
When the person asks, they ask to share slides. The second, the button next to the hand, you push that one, and then they can pick a slide deck.
What? Oh, look at that. There we go. So we're good. All right. So I see all 3 of them there. Okay. That's amazing. And does everybody get that little paper with the corner turned down thing? What's my jabber thing? Now, and the slides aren't under the meeting materials, but I think that's just whatever.
Oh, okay.
Did you do it? You shared one.
I didn't, but I could. Which one are we starting with?
It said a deck had been shared.
Now it has.
Did you do that?
Yep.
You can tell that Yov is doing it because he has the little paper thing on his green box.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, he does. Look at that. Oh my goodness. I'll tell you what. This is very, very nice, but it's also very, very complicated. And I just, like, I don't remember from like one day to the next.
We should have these things more often.
Well, that's what I said. If we did it more often, then we would remember.
Yeah.
It's like you should rekey your PKI keys once a year because that way you remember how to do it.
Right.
Nobody likes that answer, though. All right, so we don't want that one.
Something weird going on here, Phil, where the slides can be shared, but they're not available in meeting materials. But you know what? Whatever.
They're available in meeting materials on data tracker, but not here.
Right, and we've already shared the preloaded slides are there so that we can share them when we need them. So I think we're good all the way around.
Okay, so because I randomly chose this presentation, we're going to start with the ARI extension. Or I can share the other one. It's not a problem.
Hell with the agenda. I slaved over that thing, you know.
Yeah, well, the agenda says that we first start with reminding people about the note well. Which we totally should. So yes, welcome everyone to the ACME meeting. And this is an official IETF meeting, so Note 12 does apply. We didn't prepare a slide with the Note 12, but you've all seen it before, so you know what it says, and you know what you're supposed to do and what you are not supposed to do. Right. So we're going to start with delay tolerant networking. And
do we need a note taker?
Not really. These things are, there's no data that is not in the YouTube thing. So we can summarize it from the YouTube. And we're starting with DTN. That would be this one. I see that we have some people in the Jabber room, so if somebody needs to be channeled, please just let us know. I mean, I do have the Jabber on a phone app, so I'll look at it occasionally. But well, so let's start with Brian.
Okay. Am I coming through all right?
Yes, loud and
Great.
clear.
So this is going to be quite short, just a status update on more activities that are happening outside of the ACME working group that affect this draft. So if you could go to the first or the next slide, please. So I did post an update to the draft that included feedback, mostly from Roman as AD, and part of that feedback was something that got mulled around in the ACME working group, which was that the SAN URI claim was really the wrong thing to do because this is not a internet named URI. So what we did was move the certificate profile to use an other name with a new name form that's in the process of being registered as a late edit to the pre-publication TCP-CL in the DTN working group. And so as a side effect of that, the ACME claim then changes from a URI to a bundle EID, and that change is consistent with the certificate profile change that drove this whole thing. And beyond that main change, there were some clarifications of security considerations being inherited from the other protocols that are being used here, and fix some typos and other minor things. The end result is that this draft, and on the next slide, I'll talk about some small upcoming change, but there's still no change in any of the bundle protocol on the wire encoding or any of the logic related to the transport. And there's also no changes to the ACME side of the logic outside of the identifier name changed and the certificate claim is changed. But the logic of what's being done and how it's being done besides that have been unchanged. So if you skip to the next slide, please. There still is one open comment on this document, which was it's process-wise more unusual to have a document in one working group update a document in a different active working group. So taking that in mind, the easiest thing to do here is to just extract that portion of this draft document into a DTN working group, a very small update document, and use that as a normative reference here. The clarification, the update is a bookkeeping minor IANA registration thing on the bundle protocol side, but it is necessary because this is the registry that the node ID validation mechanism here is using to declare these new administrative bundle types. And I did notice as I was browsing through, there's still a few mentions of SAN URI that need to be replaced in this draft, which would turn into the SAN other name. And that's all I have about this topic.
You if you want to call them.
I see there's folks in the queue.
Yeah. Okay, so what I wanted to know is why, well, since you say that the DTN document is a 2B RFC, it's not yet an RFC, so why do we need to add a new document that updates it rather than just updating the DTN working document?
So there's two different pending documents on the DTN side. The one that contained the certificate profile was still in edit. The one that is related to this IANA registry of type code points has already passed that point. So it's really just a procedural issue, unfortunately.
Okay, I see. So it's up to the DTN working group anyway.
Yes.
I read through this draft last night in preparation for this meeting, and I had a couple thoughts, questions. Would you prefer those in email form?
Definitely, with a copy
Alrighty.
on the working group mailing list.
Yep, absolutely. I will send that out later today.
Hi, Brian. First off, I had the same question you've had, but you answered now that you said, all the coordination in the DTN working group. So I guess all I wanted to say is kind of thank you for making all these changes and boundary spanning between ACME and DTN to try to harmonize all that. I know it took a lot of effort, so much appreciated.
Hi, Brian. Can you tell me which document is going to contain the other name definition? Because it's not in in the ACME one, so I assume it's in some DTN one.
It's the TCP CLv4. That is where the actual certificate profile is located. And unfortunately, because of the timing of these updates, the reference from this ACME document is revision 26, but the actual latest one, the actual one that has made the change, is revision 27.
Okay, thanks.
And you can see the diff on that document, that where it used to say STAN URI now says the other name, and it gives a full explanation of the other name encoding and all that.
Follow-up question. So I was just checking the status. That one's in RFC edit. Why can't we change the text there, certainly when it comes to auth 48 to update the registries?
I can ping the working group again, but I think at this point the authors have considered that document as closed. It's been pending for a long time, and my understanding is we're just trying to get it through the queue.
So just for my clarity, then the working group would prefer the document to go out with the current text, and then they would prefer then to have another minor update revising that document.
So technically there's nothing wrong in the current BP-BIS document.
Got it.
But it misses a reference to the IANA registry to say, here are the code points to use other than the one that's specified in this document.
Got it.
Yeah, they acknowledged that the reference was missed, but considered it as being too late in the.
Got it. So we're talking about the BP-BIS document that's actually further along, but the profile document which
Yes.
was the one where the edits were made. That was the TCP
Yes.
CL before. Got it. All right.
That's
Thanks.
exactly it.
Much appreciated.
Okay, so unless there's anything else, so you're going to update the draft with the, you already updated it. There's the open issues that we have a way forward and a few Sun URIs to remove, and then we want to have a last call.
Yes, that would be great.
Okay. So with that, we can move to the next item on the agenda, which is, if I remember correctly, Owen, who sent us only one slide deck for both integrations and subdomains. So there it is.
Excuse me, can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Perfect. Let's go on to next slide.
I'm trying. Yeah.
Okay, so status of this was one major item of feedback on the previous version of the draft that Russ gave, and it was just to address the RFC 7030 CSR attributes gap, because we've specified in the integrations draft how to incorrectly leverage 7030 CSR attributes so that an RA can explicitly tell a pledge or a client what subject alternate name to include. There was a lot of discussion on the mailers about this over the last couple of months, and we've reached consensus on an agreed approach. There is a very drafty draft in GitHub at the moment on how to update CSR attribute handling in 7030. It will be published before IETF 112, but it's not there yet. So we will update the ACME integrations draft to reference this updated CSR attributes handling draft, and that should address the major item feedback we had at the last one. And we haven't done, so the updated version of ACME integrations hasn't been pushed out yet because we haven't published the CSR attribute handling draft yet, but that will be done in the next few weeks. So that is the only update on ACME integrations.
Any questions, comments? No, then I guess we can go on.
Okay. We can go on to the next draft and the subdomain. So next slide, please. So there's a lot of mailer discussion. I think there's two main things really. One is the need to differentiate and disambiguate between authorizations for wildcards versus authorizations for subdomains or domain namespaces. And that was actually one of the first major pieces of feedback at the MIC discussion at IETF 106 is yes, we did need to disambiguate between the two types of authorizations. And then there was a lot of debate over and back some time ago on the mailers about new order handling and whether the client, the ACME client, should be able to specify when it's sending in a new order request, whether it also needs to specify the top level domain that it has control over. I'm absolutely on the fence as to whether we need to do this in new order or not. So it's certainly the use case that Michael and I have in mind, the pre-authorization use case makes a lot more sense. So what I'm showing here is the three changes that are documented in the latest version of the subdomains draft. One is to specify for a new pre-authorization request that it is for explicitly for an authorization for the full domain namespace. Second is the change to the authorization object to differentiate between a wildcard authorization and domain namespace authorization. And the third one, which I'm completely on the fence with and I'm open to removing, is the changes to the new order request, so that a client can specify not only the identifier it wants the identifier it wants to get a certificate for, but also the top level domain namespace that it has control over. For the use case I have in mind, I think the new authorization flow makes a lot more sense for a registration authority, and the new order flow makes less sense. So I'm perfectly okay with removing the change to the new order request, but it was added as a result of pretty extensive mailer discussions maybe 6-9 months ago. And this is the only update I have, and I'd just like to discuss these 2 points.
Aaron?
The person on the other end of those mailing list discussions, I think my conclusion is that I'm perfectly happy having it in the new order flow as well. Like, I think the majority of my point was from a position of not having observed and had all the context for those previous discussions 9+ months ago. And so I was like, is any of this necessary? But in a world where we're definitely doing it for the new auth Z flow, then I think we should absolutely do it for the new order flow as well, just for symmetry on both sides.
Okay. Okay, so I think those were the only two. Those are the two major mailer open items, and I think if they are now closed, I don't think there's any. Like, sure, there'll be editorial changes to the draft required for sure, but there's no substantive changes required to the draft. It'll just be changes in language or cleaning up terminology. But I think the overall flows that are defined in the draft don't need to be changed, and the changes to any of the objects are as is. So next steps, and there was a call for working group adoption. Are we ready to bring this back to the mailer and ask the question again?
Well, we can raise the question again, but we will want to have, well, more than 2 people who have read the draft. So we'll try to see if there's a good number of people who have read the draft, want the draft, or interested in having it go through the working group and become an RFC. But yeah, so it's probably more advanced and more complete than we usually want documents to be when we're adopting them. But the big question is if there's enough interest. And we'll ask that on the mailing list.
Okay, that's it. I'm done.
Okay, so thank you. And let's go to the third item on our agenda. I think that's the one. Yeah, that's the one. So, Aaron, come back.
Yeah, so this is introducing a new draft that is currently still a personal draft. I've got some slides here. Basically, I want to go over the motivation behind this draft, a little bit of what the ACME client flow ends up looking like, the current proposed changes to ACME resources, and then take questions and talk about next steps and stuff like that. So next slide. In terms of motivation here, I've just got a bunch of diagrams. We've got, like, suppose that you are a CA and you have some sort of normal issuance volume over time. It varies a little bit. Sometimes you issue a little more, sometimes you issue a little less, and assume you have some sort of standard renewal interval. For existing ACME CAs, that's often something like 60 days, where the cert lifetime is 90 days, but clients renew early, so something like 60, but it could be anything. These axes don't have actual labels on them on purpose. Next slide. But for any number of reasons, you might have a issuance spike. Maybe your rate limits fell over and a bunch of people got through and did a bunch of issuance. Maybe you had a mass revocation event and needed to revoke a bunch of certs and issue replacements for all of them with some tweak to the certificate profile or a different issuer or something. But sometimes issuance spikes happen. They're a fact of life. So what happens after that is the question. Next slide. Naively, what happens after that is your issuance drops to nearly zero because suddenly everyone who is an existing subscriber has a valid cert and doesn't need to renew, and you still have some issuance traffic, obviously, new subscribers, people whose clients behave differently, but you drop to nearly zero for the entirety of the renewal interval, and then you have another spike. You see it coming however many days out. Every single one of these certs that you just issued in a short period is about to get renewed, and that's going to be a problem. This is something that you want to avoid. Like, that initial mass spike is maybe unavoidable. Maybe it's a compliance incident. You have to be able to issue that many certs in that small a period of time. But these future spikes, you don't want to have to deal with having that much issuance capacity all at once. You don't want to deal with that sort of spiky load. It's literally not good for your components in a data center, physically unhealthy for the electronics. So the question is, how do we smooth this out? Next slide. The basic idea is do the work early. You know that you have this issuance spike coming up in a little while. Well, what if you could say, hey, instead of waiting a full, for example, 60 days and then renewing all of these at once, what if I started renewing these now? This is a great idea. This is wonderful. It doesn't work. You cannot do it because everything is dependent on the client initiating the certificate issuance, right? Nothing is actually driven by the ACME server. Everything is driven by the ACME client. It can check in whenever it wants. It can decide to renew whenever it wants. You have no control over this. So if we could do it, that would be really cool. Next slide. Because if we could do it, we could smooth this out. We would still have that first big issuance spike for whatever reason, but then we could do proactive work ahead, smooth it out, and go back to normal issuance levels immediately. So the question is, how do you do this? And my proposal is with RE. So go to the next slide. This is a very, very simplified diagram of what an ACME client's flow looks like today. Most ACME clients, certainly not all of them, but many ACME clients wake up on a regular schedule, for example, once every 24 hours or once a week or something like that, inspect the certificate that is on disk that they are responsible for issuing and renewing, and see when it is supposed to, when it's not after date is, when it's going to expire. And then they do some math. Maybe they renew a specific number of days before the not after. Maybe they renew a specific percentage of the way through the lifetime of the certificate. There's a variety of things here, but basically it's wake up, check the certificate on disk, to realize it doesn't need to be renewed yet, go back to sleep. Repeat again the next some period later, wake up, check the cert on disk, realize it doesn't need to be renewed, go to sleep. At some point, they wake up, check the cert on disk, realize that it is time to renew, and then go talk to the ACME server, say, new order, complete the challenge, finalize, get a certificate, store that certificate on disk. And then again, immediately some period later, they wake up, check the cert on disk. Oh, it's super new. Awesome. Go back to sleep. So this is sort of the current flow for most ACME clients. Next slide. The RE proposal changes that flow to be contacting the server instead of inspecting the disk. Yes, this drastically increases the amount of traffic that the ACME server is handling, but we can talk about those details in a slightly different time. But basically, all this is doing is keeping the same basic flow for the ACME client, but instead of waking up, checking the disk, and doing some math based on the not before and not after dates of the certificate, it wakes up, makes an API call to the ACME server and says, hey, should I renew yet? And the ACME server says, here's when you should renew. And the client says, that's not right now, and goes back to sleep, exactly like it would when it inspects the local certificate. Wake up, ask the server, go to sleep. Wake up, ask the server, finally says, yeah, you should renew now-ish. Goes through the renewal flow, stores the certificate on disk. So overall, the client flow is not that different from what most clients do today. Next slide. In terms of actual concrete changes proposed by the ACME spec or by this draft, one of them is that The order resource will contain a new key value pair alongside the finalize and certificate URLs. Oh, sorry, when a order resource is in the finalized state and it has a certificate URL pointing towards the certificate for the client to download, it will also contain a renewal info URL pointing to where the client can get renewal info. Next slide. And that renewal info URL will serve a resource that looks like this, with a suggested renewal window with a start time and an end time. And the draft says that the client should uniformly pick a time between the start and end timestamps, uniformly randomly pick a time between the start and end timestamps, and choose that time to renew. Furthermore, if the time that it picks within that interval is in the past, either because it is currently partway through the interval and it selected a time a little bit in the past, or because the entire interval is in the past now, then it should renew immediately in order to not delay things even further. Next slide. That's the basic details. Obviously, there's a lot more details, a variety of shoulds and musts, etc., in the current draft, but I figured it was more useful for people to actually read the entire draft and discuss that on its own than try to cover every single one of those here in this. The big question that's been brought up on the ACME mailing list so far is about renewal info URL discoverability. The current draft, as I just mentioned, puts the renewal info URL in the order object, which means that an ACME client has to either persist the order URL so that it can refetch the order and get that renewal info URL, or the ACME client needs to persist the renewal info URL directly so that it can fetch that URL every time it wakes up to determine whether or not it should renew at this time. That obviously has complications for stateless ACME clients that don't persist any files to disk except for the final certificate that they receive. But it also has the advantage of allowing servers to construct these renewal info URLs however they please, very similar to how RFC 8555 allows the servers to construct the certificate URL however they please. The alternate proposal here that's been brought up a couple times is that the renewal info URL should instead be directly constructible from data contained within the certificate. For example, its serial number or a fingerprint across the entire contents of the certificate. This would mean that stateless ACME clients don't need to persist any information other than the certificate, but it also means that constructing the full URL means contacting the ACME server for the directory, extracting a base renewal info URL from the contents of the directory resource, concatenating that with some value computed from the local certificate, and then querying that. So it's 2 API calls every time it wakes up, one to the directory and then one to the renewal info. I think both of these proposals have merits. I look forward to additional discussion on that, either here in this forum or on the mailing list. And I also look forward to lots of other questions and discussions, because this is my first time doing this, and I'm sure I've made lots of both procedural and technical mistakes, errors, whatever. So yeah, I look forward to feedback. Yop?
Hi, so with no hats, yeah. I'm wondering, isn't the simplest way to construct the URL from the certificate just to include it as a new field?
Interesting. That's not an approach that I had considered so far. It does inflate the size of the certificate for all TLS handshakes, which is something that I I think both the like CAB forum is as a whole and Let's Encrypt in particular strives to avoid, but it's not necessarily a bad idea. I will have to do more thinking about that. Yeah, I mean, I feel weird calling on the chairs, but Deb?
Yeah.
I feel weird. I'm a new chair too, so I'm almost as new as you are. So you'd have to do that. Putting it in the cert is one way to do it, so that the client always has it. You'd need an extension to put it in, and the question is, does that extension exist, or would you have to define a new extension? So.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the things I'd have to think about. Yeah, I'd have to go digging for an extension that might work. Andrew.
Yeah, so one comment I have is that you seem to have so far focused a lot on the sort of smearing out the renewal times across the lifetime of the certificate, which is a great use case, certainly. But there's another very important use case here, which is notifying a client that a certificate is about to be revoked, and that the client has to renew before that revocation happens or the certificate stops working. And that's very important because that revocation might be happening due to compliance reasons. So I think there are two implications from this other use case. One, I think it would be good if ARI were a little bit more prescriptive on the client. Right now, it has a lot of shoulds in it and not very many musts. But I think that if a client wants to be compliant with ARI, it should be a must that it actually renews when the server tells it to renew. And the second implication is that because the revocation is happening, I think it would be very useful if monitoring tools could query the ARI endpoint to determine that a certificate is about to be revoked and needs to be renewed, and then alerts the user of the monitoring tool that this needs to take place. So that would be another argument in favor of making it constructible. From the certificate. And I see a question in chat. What's the use case for a foretold revocation? Well, that basically it would be a compliance problem. The baseline requirements say that if certain things happen, for example, a certificate is issued with a mistake in it, it needs to be revoked within a certain time frame, and the larger time frame is 5 days. So that means that the clients would have 5 days between when the misissuance is discovered and when the certificate has to be revoked per the baseline requirements, and ARI could be used to get clients to renew during that 5-day window.
Yeah, I mean, from my end, I think that's actually, yeah, so we've been not using the renew ahead of revocation use case as the primary motivator here, because we think that the smearing out load is the more compelling use case, but it is certainly a use case that exists here. And I think your comment about monitoring tools being able to construct and query renewal info URLs is an interesting and compelling one. Similarly, yeah, thank you very much for the suggestion about it being more prescriptive on clients. This is one of the places where my relative newness is certainly something that I need feedback and help with, where deciding what things should be shoulds versus musts is not my strong suit yet. So thank you for that. I had one other comment as a reply, but I've just blanked on it. I'm sorry. Yeah, Roman?
folks kind of aren't looking. No comment on the kind of the specific approaches. I mean, what would be interesting, since we're still in early days here, is does the working group think we have something here that we need to solve? And if, in case, in fact, we kind of have that, then let's kind of sink our teeth into the solution space, because that's what I'm hearing kind of the commentary around. But let's all agree so we can have progress moving forward out of this meeting. Like, do we think we need to solve this? And that gives us kind of momentum on next steps.
I don't think it's my place to comment on whether the group thinks this is an important problem. I certainly think it's an important problem, but I'm biased here.
Cheers, Aaron.
I think it's an interesting problem, and it's certainly something that we have had in running a large enterprise PKI systems. We've had issues with in the past. It would be interesting to look at what the options are to how you would solve a problem like this. I have frankly never really considered the preemptive, oh, by the way, your cert's going to be revoked, therefore you need to renew it problem. Like, not at all. But I do think smoothing out issuance so that you don't end up with these gigantic spikes is a useful thing to talk about.
So is anyone wants to argue why we should solve this problem, or the opposite, why we should not be dealing with this problem? We'll ask on the mailing list anyway, but if somebody wants to step up and say that now, that's also great.
Yeah, Andrew?
Hey, yeah, so I would like to say that there have been several certificate authority compliance incidents over the last year or so where publicly trusted certificate authorities have been unable to revoke certificates within the baseline requirement mandated timelines. So there is a lot of pressure on CAs from web browsers like Mozilla, for instance, for them to come up with a solution to this. So I think it would be great if that solution could be a standardized solution, because I think it's going to be something that CAs are going to have to come up with a solution to regardless.
Yov has a question here in chat. I'm wondering if to prevent 6 million clients from all renewing the same day rather than 100,000 every day, we instead make them all check status every day. And by status, I assume you mean OCSP status. The issue with that is that it almost solves the renew before, sorry, mind blank. It almost solves the renew before revocation problem. For example, if everyone is doing OCSP stapling, well, the cert is considered still valid until the server queries OCSP again, gets a new revoked OCSP response, and starts stapling that one. So you've got a little bit of time in there where the cert could be revoked, but that revocation is not fully in effect because of OCSP stapling, and they could renew during that time period. But doing it that way doesn't solve this load smearing problem, because you can't use OCSP to say, hey, by the way, there's absolutely nothing wrong with your cert, but we'd really like you to renew it tomorrow in order to solve our load problems. So that's one of the other reasons that we've leaned pretty hard on this load smoothing thing, is because it sort of rules out this should just be done with OCSP as a solution to this problem space.
Yeah, thanks. But my question was rather different.
Sorry.
You have 6 million clients, and the problem you're trying to solve is that all 6 million want to renew on the same day. So what you're doing here instead is having them, all of those 6 million, check every day whether whether the certificate is still good, whether they need to renew it, all that. So now you've made, at least as far as traffic is concerned, a spike just as big every day rather than once every 2 months.
Yeah, so the big idea there is that the huge spike of traffic from all of the clients checking in is going to this renewal info endpoint, which of course it depends on the implementation, but I think it's pretty easy to agree that serving a single JSON blob containing 2 timestamps is going to be less computationally intensive than doing up to 100, I think, individual validations, and then like domain control validations, and then signing and issuing a pre-certificate and submitting it to CT, and signing and issuing a final certificate. Like, just the big idea here is that the load of the renewal info endpoint is light enough that the trade-off is worth it.
Okay, so I guess we can summarize that this is there is some interest in this thing. We'll kind of cheerlead it on the mailing list, ask people to read it, and then if we get some responses, then we can do perhaps an adoption call later on.
Yeah. As always, I look forward to more comments on the draft. Andrew, I think your comment about monitoring has probably convinced me that the URL should be constructible. So I'll put together version 0.1 that switches the constructability of the renewal info URL, and we can continue discussion from there.
Okay. So thank you. And I guess we got to the any other business part. Yes, Roman.
Check in on the status of the revisions for draft IETF-ACME authority token, because I know it's blocking us proceeding on the TN off list. Do we have an idea of when we'll get some updates there?
Mary, I think I'm the only co-author that's on this call, and I can check with Tom Peterson because I think he has the editor's pen. So
okay, much appreciated.
Right now, so yeah.
Okay, perfect. If you need anything, please let me know. Thanks.
Okay.
Yes, Kathleen.
So I had an exchange with Deb, and on my draft, she had actually done a review, and I just wanted to get kind of a status of, will it go anywhere? Are people interested in it? Or do I just keep sending updates?
You posted that yesterday, day before yesterday, Monday maybe?
I think
Or
Monday, but you said there was, yeah, I think last week, and you said there was room on the agenda.
Oh, yeah.
So I already made the changes you had recommended. I just want to know if there's interest.
Okay. So I think we need to have people look at the draft and respond on the list and see whether it's something people think is important to do.
Okay, great. And the main premise of it is that it just adds additional challenge types, right? So it's had some review. A number of people have reviewed it. It adds several new challenge types, and the challenge types are independent of certificates, but it does have a few use cases that it could be tied to.
Okay.
So yeah, if there's interest, I would love to get your feedback, and I'd love to, just see if I could wrap this up sooner rather than later. So
Exactly.
thank you.
Okay, anything else? Going once, going twice. Okay, thank you all, and see you whenever we meet again.
In Madrid.
Yeah, in fake Madrid. Okay,
Thank you very much.
thank you all. Bye.